The controller factory is used directly by the MVC handler to really begin the MVC framework's execution. Its primary responsibility is to provide an appropriate type of controller to service the request. At the heart of the controller factory is the iController factory interface. Like many other components of MVC, you can build your own controller factory by implementing this interface. Now, usually you won't be building your own controller factory from scratch. If you do want to add custom functionality to this component, you would often inherit from the default controller factory and just add your changes there. Either way, examining the controller factory interface is a good way to understand what this component does. iController factory has 3 method members, and on the surface it's pretty simple to implement. I just mentioned create controller, which is the most important method and returns an instance of iController. Remember, a controller factory can theoretically provide almost any type of functionality to handle a request, as long as it returns a class that implements iController. The next method is getControllerSessionBehavior. This method determines how session is handled for the provided controller. For example, in some cases it makes sense to have controllers that maintain no session state at all, such as in certain performance-oriented situations. There's also a method called releaseController, which just releases any resources the factory is holding onto. Now for our purposes, we really want to focus on this first createController method. We want to focus on the classes and members that really drive the MVC pipeline forward. The MVC framework kindly provides a robust controller factory for us right out of the box, which is aptly named Default Controller Factory. This class handles a lot of the low-level work that we would not want to do ourselves. To begin with, it provides a nice conventions-based approach to creating controllers that just makes our lives easier. It's also very good at maintaining awareness of what controllers are available in our application. So, for example, if we request a URL with a segment called product, the controller factory will extract that and build a product controller to handle the request. The default factory also has access to a dependency resolver to fetch instances of the controller that it decides on for a given request. This is a great feature that allows for patterns like dependency injection. Many DI frameworks set a custom dependency resolver for your application, which can empower your controller factory with more robust options, like creating controllers with parameterized constructors. Let's return to the MVC source code for a moment to prove some of the concepts that we've been discussing. So in my browser, I have the MVC handler class open again. Now, in the last module, we looked at this process request method. Let's take a closer look at the process request init method that's called inside of it here. So if we scroll down just a bit, we can see where this is defined. There are a few important lines of code that we really want to focus on here. You can see how this method is pulling in the name of the controller out of our route data, and that was populated by the current request. So remember that route data is supplied based on the route that was matched from our MVC application. The controller value is assigned to a variable that's passed into the createController method a couple lines down here. This is one of the important methods we discussed, so let's jump over to the default controller factory's code to see what that looks like. At the top of this class, we can see that it implements the iController factory interface that we discussed. If we scroll down a bit, we can see the createController method, which has parameters for the request context and the controller name from the route data. At the bottom of this method, you can see that it's calling getControllerInstance. This method is one additional level of abstraction, but the important thing to know is that it calls the create method on the controller activator class, which can also use our dependency resolver. We can see this if we scroll down to the bottom. So this might seem like a lot of steps, but the most important thing to remember is that the controller factory class builds a controller for the MVC handler to use. It can acquire an instance of the controller using the activator and the dependency resolver. I really like to illustrate this using the actual MVC source code because I think it makes things feel less like magic if you can see the actual code yourself. In the next lesson, let's write some of our own code to reinforce this process by building a simple controller factory implementation.